And I was really struggling preparing what to say tonight, not because I hadn't prepared or I hadn't done this, but because it's an interesting topic, integrity. What does that actually mean, to do the right thing? And I prepared something, and then I thought, no, I need to look at this. So if you have your Bible with you, turn to Genesis chapter 39, and we're going to look at the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And I'm going to read this, and I'm going to read the whole chapter, because there's one word in here that jumped out on me. You can take the picture off now, Cliff, thanks. There's one word that jumped out on me, and I just thought it was good to share it. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Do you see that in verse 3? It says, when his master saw that the Lord was with him. He knew that God was with him. Verse 4, halfway through. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything other than the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Verse 8, but he refused. I love that word, refused. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused. He refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Verse 11, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "The Hebrew slave you bought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." And when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph, and he gave him success in whatever he did. So Joseph has been set up big time. He's been falsely imprisoned, but he did nothing wrong. And I love that word. He refused. He didn't even step over a line. He refused. he refused to even be with her, and the Lord was with him. Now that's a big story, and there's a whole lot in there. I could just stop at that word refuse and go on that. But I want to just share something from that, because in Joseph's example, the primary point was that he was a man of integrity. And integrity isn't always something that we hear a lot talked about. But it said, even Potiphar in verse 3 had noticed that the Lord was with him. He was faithful to his work when his boss was absent. And that's what we read of in Colossians 3 verse 23. You don't need to turn to it. But it tells us what to do in our work. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as if working for the Lord, not for men. In verse 9 and 10 in this chapter, we read that Joseph walked in faithfulness. And it wasn't a one-time temptation. She tempted him day after day after day after day. And Joseph walked with God. He ran from sin. And that's what the Bible tells us to do in James chapter 4, verse 7. It says that we are to resist the devil and to flee from him. And could you just put the picture up, Cliff, the next one? You'll all recognize this guy. If you don't, I'll tell you. This is Tiger Woods. Now, I confess, I don't know anything about golf, really. Other than the story I read this week that in Australia they've got a shark-infested golf course. And I thought, that sounds fun. They've also stopped children collecting the loose balls that get lost in the lake now, because they had a flood and sharks came in. And that was probably one of the most interesting stories I've read. So apologies if you're into golf. But I do know about this story. Why? Because last year, Tiger Woods' story was all over the news. He had an affair, he betrayed his wife, and he's perhaps one of the most famous sports players in our time. He was irresponsible. And one quote he said, "My failures have made me look at myself in a way I never wanted to before. It's now up to me to make amends, and that starts by never repeating the mistakes I've made. It's up to me to start living a life of integrity." And I once heard, and I believe it's true, someone said, it's not what you achieve in life that matters. It's what you overcome. Achievements on the golf course are only part of setting an example. Do you know what he said really counts? Character and decency. And this is from a guy who's just messed up, and it's all over the whole world.